himself frustrated in the search for self-expression, or the expression of culture through himself, he gradually lags on every other level of life. It is like the person whose psychology is confused, and in a short time this confusion causes him to be inefficient as a businessman, causes him to be inefficient as a family person, and causes him gradually to lose even the desire to live. The loss of the desire to live is very often associated with the loss of cultural drive, the loss of the drive to make the world better and more beautiful, rather than merely bigger and stronger. This means that to anthropology, the future of the world must depend upon its cultural leadership. And it points out that this has always been the case, that the truly honored names, the great people who are remembered, are for the most part powerful culture units. We admire the individuals who have left us beauty more than we admire those who have left us strength. We may write some histories about Napoleon and people of that nature, but in our simple daily living, we are much closer to our poets, to our mystics, to our scholars, to our artists. We feel a kinship with that which is lovable and is essentially beautiful and good. And we bestow gradually, and perhaps very tardily, our applause upon those who have made such contributions. Thus, instinctively, we seek culture, and we seek cultural outlet, but we do not know exactly how to make it fit into the present program of things. Anthropology, like all other branches of learning, appeals to both individuals and to groups. As an individual, the attainment of culture is perhaps easier than it is on a collective level. At the same time, however, collective momentums, once they can be created, once they can be caused to move, very often carry whole groups of persons with them along the road to some powerful cultural achievement. So anthropology says that tomorrow, the future of the world in which we live, is a future very skillfully and wonderfully compounded out of the beauty, out of the truth, out of the nobility that has preceded us, plus the vision which we ourselves can bestow, and the coordination which the contemporary must always impose upon the fragments of non-contemporary ideas. Thus we gather, we bring together that which has previously been given and use it as an immediate instrument of insight and interpret it, rearrange it, and cause it to fit into the pressing need of beauty or of truth or of wisdom or of love within our own existence and our own personal culture problem. So the anthropologist takes it for granted that if the world 100 years from now is merely a further exaggeration of the present world, that the future is merely the present pushed into the next century, that we are going to be in a very bad way, and that in all probabilities, if we push the now far enough, we will simply exterminate ourselves. This point is defensible on grounds of examining other peoples who got into ruts by which they were unable to keep the cultural sky clear above them. They lost the power to be free to become better, and in so doing they signed their own death warrants. Actually, however, nature is such that it is very difficult to lock man totally within a mechanistic pattern. He rebels of himself. The pattern becomes too heavy for him. He finds himself sicker and sicker under it, until on one level or another he rebels. Therefore, man by instinct is a breaker of patterns. He is a constant rebel against the authorities which lock him. And for this reason alone, despotism can seldom permanently achieve its ends. These ends create so much reaction that the despotism itself is ultimately overthrown. However, with the present type of mind, anthropology points out the danger of the contamination of imagination by our present way of life. Actually, our imagination, or the inner life of the creativity of the person, if this becomes infected to the degree that he cannot find anything more beautiful than what he is doing, or that what he is doing satisfies him so completely that he is not culturally hungry, this is bad, this is dangerous. And that is the reason why it is unfortunate that science, religion, literature, art, music, and all of these diversified elements which should make up culture all become locked in one pattern. If this is so, then there is no open ground for rebellion. There is no obvious need for things to be different. And the individual escaping from one pattern falls into only another bracket of the same pattern. And in this way gains no true relief or release from pattern. Culture is always associated with a kind of archetype. Every people has had its dream. It has had some deeply submerged purpose which drives it, which has prevented it from extinction, which has caused it to defend its institutions to the bitter end. This drive has always in it some utopian clause or phase. It is always in some way the belief that we all live by, that tomorrow is going to be a little better. This problem of tomorrow being better, of course, runs against philosophy, for tomorrow can only be better if we make it better. And the problem of hope without work also offers no tangible solution. But it is dangerous to us as individuals and as groups to think of better, this better tomorrow, without seeing or feeling in it any release or expression for the instinctive desire of our own for happiness, peace, security, friendliness, kindliness, cooperation, and understanding. When we cannot look forward to these as having some advancement, then we are locked within the very selfish and dubious pattern of some way transferring or attempting to find consolation merely in toys which in themselves solve nothing. And the idea of the rocket reaching the moon is a kind of a toy which we use and which becomes important to us very largely to the degree that we are a frustrated, neurotic people. Not that this will actually bring us any happiness, but we will become wildly excited the day it happens. We will all shake hands with everybody, feel that we have made a monumental step in the conquest of existence, and then go right on with exactly the same personal problems we have always had. And if it should happen that somewhere along the line we happen to find a warlike planet that looks like it might want to invade us or something of that nature, the discovery will bring us not peace, but further fears, doubts, and misgivings. So actually, we have no reason to assume that any type of activity which has failed to produce happiness in the past is likely to produce it in the future. And what we term happiness is becoming more and more a sort of resigning to inevitables. It's a very static thing. The individual doing the best he can, which is very poor. And hoping for the best without very much ground for hope in that direction. If, on the other hand, culture is allowed to have its own way, the anthropologist can see a great many things that desperately need the doing, and he bases his concepts now upon his own scientific estimation of what has been done. He examines the great motion of culture itself, not the motion that we have imposed upon it, but the grand motion, which can be estimated perhaps only in terms of 10, 20, 50, or 100,000 years. He perceives dimly that there is a grand strategy in this moral, ethical, cultural motion within and around man. He perceives that where man does not know where he is going, that there is a motion that will carry him there if he will let it carry him there. And that this motion is not mysterious or inexplicable in itself. That it is a reasonable motion. And out of certain experiences that he has observed and studied, and which he approaches almost psychologically in recognizing the results of various errors in culture upon the groups where these errors arose. The anthropologist sees himself moving along towards something that could be very much better than it is today, and which he feels has importance. He thinks of science as making certain definite contributions to this, not because science primarily may have intention of contributing to culture, although many scientists undoubtedly do feel the importance of their cultural contribution. There are certain things, however, which science makes possible, and these things are essentially, perhaps, under two headings: communication and transportation. These two are perhaps among the most important scientific contributions to culture. Communication, while it begins with a problem that is unsolved, still offers a suggestion for solution. It is interesting that scientifically we should have invented means of carrying the human voice around the world long before we invented any means by which the people listening could come to understand each other's words. It is interesting that we have world communication on a mechanical level, on an electrical level, and we still have language barriers by means of which this marvelous invention is prevented from reaching 3/4 of its potential audience. This is an example of where science, ignoring culture, is now faced with a debit. The Voice of America, trying to work, for instance, in the Iron Curtain countries, has quite an elaborate procedure on its hands. It must bring in individuals of many languages and have these programs carefully translated for the benefit of people who do not speak each other's languages, but we hope sometime will work together economically, politically, or culturally. So we have solved the great problem of communication, but not the basic one, namely that communication is a problem of individuals having a spoken word in common. Thus, anthropology points out the tremendous importance of the development and final recognition of an international language. This is both anthropologically and politically indicated. And we've had experiments, but most of them have been half-hearted. Perhaps the outstanding experiment up to the present time has been Esperanto. But we still are faced with the problem that science now makes it possible for men to communicate with each other. And through various devices such as television, motion pictures, things of that nature, it is possible for us to share very largely in the cultural lives of other people. But in our motion pictures, most cases, these sharings are destroyed by the falsification of the documentation. No effort is made for authenticity. And for that reason, we think we are sharing and we become more befuddled than before. And a school teacher not long ago told me that it's very difficult to teach children history when they are exposed to motion pictures in which history is distorted out of all shape and form in the effort to preserve or to create some falsified romantic situation. A next problem that we do have that can be anthropologically significant is transportation. Here we have the possibility of the individual moving quickly into other culture groups and also moving toward the experience of world contact with culture. Areas totally isolated 50 years ago are now accessible in terms of hours. It is perfectly possible for the individual to have first-hand contact with his world. Transportation also breaks down the immediate isolation of purely local cultural patterns. 100 years ago, only 1 person in 10 left an area of 100 miles of his birthplace during his lifetime. Today, nearly everyone has the opportunity of looking over the fence into somebody else's yard and see what is going on there. This is culturally significant, but loses most of its value unless these elements are emphasized, pointed out, and given an opportunity to bear their proper fruit. Of course, world trade also has an effect on culture, for culture has always, almost automatically, followed the trade routes. And where we enter a country perhaps largely to buy its goods, we may ultimately share its culture. This has been a common experience for the last 10,000 years. Anthropology then points out the importance at this particular phase of coming into a rational communion with world culture, and very definitely points out that cultures do not overlap nearly as much as we think they do. It is still possible to distinguish practically all cultural patterns, even if you mix them up. You can rediscover the separate threads and put them together again. Cultures are highly complementary. Against the complementary relation of culture is your highly competitive attitude of so-called superior peoples. Anthropology says that one thing we've got to get out of our system forever is the concept of superior people. That we must have the concept of essentially different people, each one to be measured by its own yardstick and recognized for its potential contributions to a total culture as yet incomplete. If any race or nation or culture group had performed the miracle of producing a perfect culture, then we might say that others are not necessary. But we stand as we have always stood, in the immediate need of additional complementary culture. And we assume that the natural way to find that is to go where it is. Not to think on terms of borrowing or of lending, but of recognizing that culture is a unit, a totality, revealing itself through an infinite diversity of culture patterns and culture groups. Taking this as a foundation, we can work for a unity of cultures even as we work for political unity. And we can work for religious unity even as we work for scientific unity. We observe with some interest that a great many scientists belonging to other and different nations, even some that are not compatible with our own political theories, as men and as scientists can gather and discuss and think and talk things over without the animosities that you normally might expect. For wherever the individual has ideas bigger than himself, He can share those ideas with others on a like cultural level. And wherever it's impossible to share, there is evidence that the cultural bonds are not strong enough. And without these bonds, the peace of the future can never be assured. In this way, anthropology, looking forward into the future, is not content to think in terms of the new conveniences, the new commodities, and the new situations that may arise in the management of our temporal and commercial activities. There must be this new world, this new wonderful and beautiful world that we desperately need in order to justify our existence now or any other time. Assuming that the motion of culture is genuine, that the anthropologist is correct, that he has dimly perceived this motion and is able to project it into the future, and therefore that 100 years from now will not merely be today pushed into tomorrow, but will be an ascending arc of attainment, an achievement beyond and above the continuation of things as they are. How will he estimate or conceive this new level of life to be? He tells us that the only answer to that is within his jurisdiction is the concept that this ascent means that more of the inside of man will come out, and more of the good things we have always known will be apparent than are now obvious. In consequence of this, there will be a fulfillment, to a degree at least, of man's most secret longings and hopings, as well as this motion forward. Therefore, that in 100 years from now, we will say, it is perfectly conceivable that man, becoming more anthropologically conscious of the concept of culture, may bring about marked changes in the three departments which we have already mentioned, namely the departments of nationality and of religion and of language. The anthropologist feels convinced that the progress of world language will go on more rapidly than it has in the past, not imperiled simply by cultural motive, but by economic motive, but achieving in its ultimate end the establishment of a more common understanding between human beings. This understanding may at first not be a true sharing of language. It may begin, as it has already begun, in the greater ability of translation, the appearance of the better literary works of various groups in the published languages of other groups, so that today we can look forward to a greater availability of world literature, and will be in this country, for example, relieved of the overburden of Mediterranean literature and the total lack of literature from practically every other part of the world. The anthropologist will nod his head with a certain quiet sense of satisfaction when he realizes that now probably 100 or 200 of the world's great classics from every nation can be found in book form at under 50 cents a copy. He feels this is important, because the individual who today begins to study these or to read them even superficially is building the beginnings of cultural bridges. He is beginning to create what culture must have, and that is sympathy, a certain tolerance, a certain understanding, the amazing and incredible discovery that somebody beside himself has done something in this world, that he is not a patriot because he closes his eyes to the achievements of everyone but his own, that anthropology calls him to a higher patriotism, and that is a patriotism to the common good, which must be advanced, and without which the good of individual nations can never be properly advanced. The second important contribution lies in national psychology. And national psychology is also in the process of being broken down. And we find greater and greater economic and cultural exchange between nations than we have ever known before. So that we are in a cultural motion, although as yet it is too slight to have any direct bearing upon the grand scheme of our living. Anthropologists are of the suspicion that if student exchanges and things like this go on for another 100 years, there will be cultural motion. That this cultural motion will mean that there will be fewer strangers in this world. And the great barrier to all true progress is the stranger. And the stranger is not only the individual from another country, but the person working alongside of us whom we have never known. The stranger is the neighbor next door we have never spoken to. And from this it extends on to the individual of other racial or biological groups with which we have never formed cultural bridges, and therefore whose life, work, and contribution to the common good we have totally ignored or terribly underestimated. Religion also comes strongly under this anthropological concept. And religion is going to be what the British so often refer to as the sticky wicket in most cases. Because religion differs in many ways from most other parts of the cultural motion, and it exaggerates the difficulties which we find in the other groups, because religion moves around revelation, and revelation is nearly always involved in uniqueness, and uniqueness is nearly always the basis of segregation and separation. If this means, therefore, that in order to be true to your faith, you must deny all other faiths, you put a terrible barrier in the way of cultural integration. But at the same time, you are contributing markedly to the danger of war. So we have a situation of the deepest importance. Religious isolation is very apt to cause the collapse of civilization. So where does our allegiance lie? Some persons would say, go on to the bitter end. If the world falls to pieces, I've been true to my faith. This viewpoint is still quite popular, by the way. It has many more followers than we realize. But the anthropologist, who is looking objectively at the problem, and hopes that he is standing in a position in which he is not biased, comes to the realization, or comes to the conclusion, that this is too great a price to pay for religious isolation, that its moral example is more destructive than the virtue that it attains, that when we separate human beings so tremendously, we should at least have extremely adequate grounds upon which to create such separation, and that in fact we have not this ground. We speak of the uniqueness of a revelation. We remove from this uniqueness proper names and nothing else, and we have nothing left that's unique. How many people realize this? We should realize it with the golden rule in 48 languages and in every religion of the world. Where then is this uniqueness? This uniqueness, anthropology tells us, or affirms, to be the result of miscomprehension, misunderstanding, and restriction or limitation of cultural insight. And he does not feel that the uniqueness is valuable enough, important enough, or real enough to permit it to threaten the entire progress of mankind. He therefore takes what he considers to be a proper ground. Now, anthropology would never attempt to force its own ideas upon man as a religion. It has no concept of doing so. Nor would it advise or advocate all men with the same religion. It does not wish to take away from man the uniqueness of what he believes to be the dispensation under which he exists. The only thing it requires of him is that he shall take a cultured attitude towards those of other beliefs, that he shall recognize the possibility of common enrichment, that in all matters that he will have a proper attitude of respect, a proper attitude of sympathy, a cheerful willingness to cooperate with those of other faiths and other beliefs, and the capacity to perceive that a good man is a culture man, and that this good man has never been produced solely by one faith, that a good man is more important than an affiliated man, that the fact that the individual becomes better is the final evidence of the contribution of religion to life. Therefore, the good man, whatever he may be and whatever he may believe, is entitled to the common respect of all other good men. Anthropology is very hopeful that within 100 years this concept will be, if not universal, far more so than it is now. We may not be able to overcome all prejudice, but anthropology points out that we are being forced into this position, often against our will, by a motion in society which cannot be stopped, and that this motion means that either we must move with it or expose ourselves to another cycle of holy wars. And most people at the present moment are tired of even thinking of holy wars, letting alone to indulge in one. It is very doubtful if today the world could really work itself into a proper mood for a major crusade. Already the violence of these attitudes has been rather seriously undermined. It is doubtful if it would get much further than a verbal outbreak. But it could. And anthropology warns that if it should, it could wreck a cultural motion for a long time to come. Anthropology hopes in its own thinking that the motion of heterogeneous faiths, the gradual recognition that we do business with people, and that this person who as socially was a stranger becomes an important element in the success of our activities. We become to be more dependent upon the farmer in Indonesia, the rich caliph or the rich sheikh of the Near East with his oil wells, the importance of the Formosan as a front line of defense against somebody else, the need of cultural contact with Japan as possibly the western boundary of our way of life. These things are forcing us to realize that we cannot ridicule a man and then expect him to stand with us in an emergency. So we have to at least take on an appearance of civility. This appearance, coupled with greater and greater contact. I know a man who is engaged in a large business in this country. He has been an executive of that business for 40 years. He is only a few years from retirement. For the first 35 years of that position as an executive, he sat with his feet under one desk. In the last 5 years, he has made 42 trips around the world for his business only. This means something. It means a motion. This man has no longer the same concepts of the world that he had while his feet were under the desk. He cannot. He does not. He is discovering like a small boy a world of wonders that he never knew existed. He is chuckling, he is brimming over, and the fatigue which made retirement seemed very attractive 5 years ago has disappeared, and he hopes he can stay on for another 10 years and keep on doing it. He has suddenly found, as we are finding, what Wilkie called the one world front. That today, if you want to make a better mousetrap, you've got to import most of the materials. And that in only one or two scientific elements does the United States of America supply its own basic needs. This has its effect, and we must sometime, even as businessmen, realize that you cannot ridicule your brother's God and buy from him at a profit. It just won't work. So a condition is being forced upon us, meaning cultural insight. And let us not forget that the man we visit, and who in turn from some other place visits us, is passing through the same experiences that we are. Individuals who actually believe that the world ended in the Sea of Yemen have suddenly discovered that it didn't. And it has been estimated that the three great dictators with whom we had trouble not so many years ago would probably not have been nearly so troublesome had any one of them been a traveler. But they were not. They had the delightful consistency of believing they lived in a small world and that there was very little other world. Thus, they were right ready to be despots, and they were. Culture thus sees the inevitable improvement of itself and the advancement of its purposes through being forced into a new relationship with peoples. The United Nations presents another phase of this. The Geneva situation is still another. The League of Nations, the Hague Conferences, all of these different motions carry certain cultural overtones. But against them, the uninitiated person raises such barriers of prejudice and restriction that they go far less rapidly than we would normally wish that they could. The motion cannot be stopped, however. And within the next century, we must either move with this situation or else set up blocks and barriers which will almost certainly lead us to the worst international catastrophe we have ever known. This being pretty obvious, the anthropologist feels that education should hearken to him a little more, that there should be greater emphasis in educating young people from the beginning in the fact that they are growing up on a planet and not in a community, that they are growing up in a moving world and not strictly and entirely in a restricted local area, that they are going to be forced to know, understand, and do business with a great many peoples. Also, anthropology is concerned, in the United States particularly, with the unfortunate and rather limited monolinguist situation that we have here. The European has one advantage over the American in this respect. The average European speaks 2 to 3 languages. The average American does not. Therefore, in an emergency or under situations, he is not able to handle things as well as he should. It is only within the last 25 years it has ever occurred to us to teach languages even to our diplomats. And there are a great many individuals holding office in various countries and representing the United States who do not speak one word of the language of the country in which they're located. This is bad. This helps to preserve prejudices and at best leaves the representation of the nation in the uncertain hands of an interpreter who can destroy the entire meaning or pervert it in any way may please him, and the most concerned individual will never know it. This type of thing means bridging constantly, and is the reason why the anthropologist is so concerned with language bridges. As an anthropologist also, he is not without his interest in ethnology or without interest in biological and psychological aspects of his problem. He recognizes that culture, essential culture, is the basis of what we might term integration. He realizes realizes that the lack of culture within the individual is the principal cause of his tension, that the international lack of culture is the principal cause of international tension. International tension reacts on every individual. Individual tension, if it accumulates in enough persons, gradually assumes the form of national tension. If, therefore, unreasonable tension exists anywhere, it ultimately destroys the smooth running of whatever mechanism is involved with that tension. Consequently, anthropology, looking forward into the future, assumes